The town was silent. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy silence that follows years of looking the other way. The sky hung low, flags didn't move. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. A man was buried. A sheriff stood watching, and in that moment everything cracked. He reached for his gun, confident, untouchable, unchallenged. But what he didn't know was that the man standing across from him wasn't just grieving. He was a federal agent, and he'd been waiting for that move, that moment, that proof. In front of the town, the law turned its gaze, not away this time, but straight at the man behind the badge, and said, "Justice has arrived. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now?" The sky that morning looked like it hadn't slept all night. Thick gray clouds drifted low above the old cemetery hill, casting a quiet, tired gloom over everything they touched. A light wind rustled the trees around the perimeter, their leaves whispering secrets no one would dare speak out loud. The gravel path was wet but not muddy, just enough to soften the sound of the shoes that crunched along it, slow measured steps of people carrying more than just grief. The flag in Noah Ellison's hands felt heavier than it should have, folded perfectly into that familiar triangle, the blue and white of it darker from the damp air, but the weight came from somewhere deeper than fabric. Thread. He hadn't set foot in this town in almost 10 years, not since his retirement from the Justice Department. There had been nothing left for him here, not since his brother Julian stayed behind to fight the same battles Noah had grown tired of. But now he was back, standing at the head of a burial plot, staring down into the earth that had taken his only sibling. The coffin sat in place, draped in honor, but the ache in Noah's chest wasn't pride. It was a quiet fury he couldn't quite name. Julian wasn't just a brother. He was the last of a kind that still believed systems could be repaired from the inside. Someone behind him cleared their throat, not loudly, but with just enough edge to signal something unwelcome. Noah didn't turn. He didn't have to. He could feel it, the static in the air, the shift in posture among the mourners, the subtle tightening of shoulders like a sudden draft had swept through. But the chill came from something other than the weather. Sheriff Roy Beckett had arrived. Not late, not early, just uninvited. His boots clicked too firmly against the wet stone, his presence cutting through the funeral with the confidence of a man who had never once been told no. Noah kept his back to him, eyes forward, lips tight. Julian's widow Miriam stood just to his right, holding their son's hand, her knuckles white with the pressure. She leaned in and whispered, "Why is he here?" Noah didn't answer. Instead, he took a breath, slow and steady, letting the tension settle into his ribcage like it had a right to be there. It had been a long time since he'd had to steel himself like this. But the past, it seemed, had come looking for him. The preacher's voice began low and warm, but even that couldn't drown out the unwanted gravity pulling Beckett into every moment. Noah could feel the man's gaze on his back, thick, unblinking, almost amused. And for the first time in years, Noah felt the old urge again. Not to run, not to fight, but to wait, to watch. Beckett had always been one for spectacle, for asserting dominance with subtle cruelty, and something told him today would be no different. "You know," a voice said, loud enough to cut through the preacher's reading, casual enough to drip with contempt, "we shouldn't pretend this man was some kind of hero." Murmurs flinched around the grave, like someone had slapped the wind out of them. Noah didn't turn. He just lowered his head, eyes closing for a breath that tasted of wet soil and old regret. Beckett's voice came again, closer now, always poking around where he didn't belong, stirring up noise where there wasn't any. Noah finally turned, slowly, deliberately. His eyes met Beckett's with the calm of a man who had seen worse men fall. "Not here," he said, voice low but firm, like the last thread of patience stretched across a canyon of old wars. Beckett just smiled, that lazy, crooked thing he always did when he wanted to humiliate without raising his voice. "You people never learn," he said under his breath, just loud enough for Noah to hear. "Think you can clean up what's too deep to scrub." The preacher had gone silent. The others didn't move. Noah could feel them all around, stuck between grief and fear, between mourning and dread. Beckett took a slow step closer, boots gritting the gravel. "I hope you're not planning on making noise too, Noah. Would be a shame to lose both Ellison boys in the same year." And there it was, the shift, the turn. That one breath between the peaceful and the poisoned. Noah didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just looked at Beckett like a man measuring something not worth the trouble, and yet too dangerous to leave unchecked. "Say what you came to say," he replied, "then get the hell out of my brother's funeral." Beckett leaned in slightly, eyes hard now, voice low and smooth like oil spilled on stone. "Watch yourself, counselor. This town remembers who runs things." Noah's smile was thin, worn, but still alive. "That's the problem," he said, turning back toward the grave. "I remember too." And behind him the wind shifted again, not the weather, but something sharper, something electric. A funeral was supposed to be quiet, sacred, but today it had become a battlefield. And Noah knew the first shot hadn't been fired with a gun, but with a look, a word, a presence that didn't belong. Something was coming, and this time he wasn't walking away. The drizzle had softened into a mist by the time the last shovelful of earth was packed down, leaving the cemetery wrapped in a damp, uneasy quiet that clung to skin and thought alike. The wind drifted through the trees, like it had nowhere to be, carrying the smell of wet grass and old stone, while the crowd around the grave began to thin their eyes, low their steps, slow the weight of mourning settling into their shoulders. Like a second coat, Noah stayed where he was unmoving, the folded flag still in his arms, the final prayer still echoing faintly in his ears, though the words had long since lost meaning. The preacher had done his part, the family had said their goodbyes, but something in Noah's bones told him the ceremony wasn't over. Not yet. Not with Roy Beckett still standing 20 feet away, arms crossed, watching with the kind of stare that didn't belong at a funeral. Noah didn't need to look directly to feel it, that slow-burning, deliberate hostility, the kind that wasn't meant to explode but to erode like rust creeping across iron. Beckett wasn't saying anything now, but his silence spoke volumes, and Noah had spent too many years reading men like him to mistake stillness for peace. The sheriff was doing what men like him always did, staking territory, reminding the room who had the last word, even if that room happened to be a graveyard and the audience was grieving. Noah exhaled through his nose, steadying his heartbeat, resisting the urge to react. Reaction was what Beckett wanted. A flicker of anger, a raised voice, something to twist and replay. But Noah had been in too many courtrooms, too many negotiations with men twice as slick and just as dangerous to offer him that satisfaction. Miriam reached out, gently brushing Noah's arm with her fingertips, her voice barely audible over the shifting wind. "Let's go," she said, not as a suggestion but as a mother's plea to protect her son from things he shouldn't have to witness. Noah nodded, but his feet didn't move just yet. He gave one last look to the grave, then to the headstone already placed at the edge, still damp from the rain. Julian Marcus Ellison, beloved father, brother, fighter. The dates carved beneath didn't seem long enough to account for everything his brother had carried, but the space between them, those years of work resistance, sleepless nights, that was where the real story lived. They turned together, Noah and Miriam, guiding the boy gently by the shoulder toward the narrow path that led back to the main road. The other mourners followed at a respectful distance, casting brief glances at Beckett, but no one dared hold his gaze too long. He wasn't shouting anymore, but the damage had already been done. That single comment, "we shouldn't pretend he was a hero," had landed like a punch, and its echo now hung in the air heavier than the storm clouds overhead. As Noah walked, he could hear faint murmurs behind him, whispers of disbelief, discomfort, and something else. Fear. Not of the man in the coffin, but of the one still standing upright. Halfway to the gate, Noah slowed his pace, the rhythm of his steps interrupted by the sudden memory of a conversation he'd had with Julian only months ago. They'd been sitting on the back porch of the house. Julian refused to sell, watching the sun set over the same fields they'd played in as boys. "He's never gonna stop," Julian had said, meaning Beckett, though he never once used the man's name. "But I'm not gonna stop either. That's the difference. I can't afford to." Noah had stared at his brother then, not with admiration but concern, knowing too well what standing in front of power could cost. "You think you can win that fight?" he had asked, more out of love than doubt. Julian had smiled, not with arrogance, but with a quiet, worn certainty. "I just want the next kid to know someone tried." That memory sat heavy now as Noah reached the cemetery gate and turned to look one last time. Beckett was still there, still watching, still measuring. Their eyes met across the distance, just a flicker of connection, not quite a challenge but not an acknowledgement either. Beckett tipped his head ever so slightly like a man amused at a private joke, and Noah knew what it meant. This wasn't over. The funeral had been an opening move, a test of posture, and the sheriff had just drawn a line in the mud for Noah to cross. Back at the car, Miriam opened the door for her son and gently helped him in her hands, shaking just slightly now that it was safe to tremble. Noah stood by the driver's side for a moment, letting the wind press against his coat, letting the town he thought he'd left behind settle into his lungs again. This place hadn't changed much, not really. The buildings were older, maybe the storefronts quieter, but the current beneath the power structures, the fear, the silence, those were still intact. And now his brother was buried beneath them, another name etched in stone, another voice silenced too soon. As he pulled the car door shut and started the engine, the radio flickered on a gospel song playing faintly through static. Miriam turned it down, but Noah left it just loud enough to fill the silence. No one spoke on the ride back into town. There wasn't anything left to say, not yet. But in the back of his mind, Noah was already making a list. Not of people, but of questions. Why was Beckett there who gave him the nerve? And what had really happened on that road the night Julian died? Outside, the sky remained heavy, unmoved, and so did Noah's face, calm, focused, unreadable. But beneath it, something had begun to stir. Not revenge, not rage, but resolve. Something had broken loose at that graveside, and once it started moving, there would be no way to put it back. By the time they reached the church parking lot, the last of the mourners had already scattered, leaving only a few idling cars and the echo of footsteps slipping into silence. The sun hadn't come out, not really just a faint brightening behind the clouds like the day was trying to decide whether to move forward or stay suspended in mourning. Noah stood beside the rental car, his coat collar pulled up against the breeze, one hand resting on the hood as if anchoring himself to something solid in a world that had lost its shape. He wasn't ready to leave, not yet. And the way Miriam looked at him, one part worry, one part resignation, told him she understood that too well to argue. Inside the car, her son sat quietly in the back seat, swinging his legs in slow rhythm, eyes fixed on nothing in particular, the way children sometimes do when they sense the adults around them are carrying burdens too heavy to name. Miriam stepped around to Noah's side and placed a gentle hand on his arm, her voice soft but steady. "You shouldn't give him space in your head, not today." Noah didn't answer right away. He just watched the tree line across the lot where the wind stirred the branches like whispers gathering force. When he finally spoke, it wasn't for comfort or clarity, it was just truth. "He's always been in my head. Today just reminded me how much." She didn't press him further. She knew this wasn't about pride or vengeance or even grief, not entirely. It was about unfinished business, the kind that leaves splinters under the skin and grows sharper the longer it's ignored. She squeezed his arm once, then moved to the passenger seat without another word. Noah stayed where he was, staring out across the gray horizon, until a voice broke the stillness like a stone through glass. "Well, I figured you'd turn up eventually," Beckett said, his voice carrying that oily drawl that always came just before he said something calculated to wound. Noah didn't flinch. He turned slowly, his posture calm but alert, eyes scanning the sheriff as he sauntered across the pavement, like a man checking his own fences. Beckett wore that same too-clean uniform, the gold trim, catching what little light filtered through the clouds, his badge gleaming like it had something to prove. "Never could stay away from a good mess, could you?" he added, stopping just short of invading personal space. Noah let the silence stretch, counting the seconds, not out of patience but precision. Then in a voice so even it barely rippled the air, he replied, "This was never your funeral to show up at." Beckett tilted his head slightly, as if amused, but his eyes narrowed by a fraction, a crack in the facade, if you knew where to look. "Julian and I had unfinished business," he said, seemed only right. "I pay my respects." "You mean pay your dominance?" Noah said flatly, the words slipping out colder than he intended, but no less true. Beckett smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Still got that federal tone, I see. All facts, no feelings." Then he stepped closer, his boots scuffing the damp gravel, voice lowering like he wanted this moment to feel intimate. "Your brother thought he could change the way this place runs. Thought he could call the shots just because he knew the law. But around here, law ain't what's written, it's what's lived." Noah didn't step back. He didn't even blink. He had learned a long time ago that men like Beckett thrive on reaction, feed off it like wolves on fear. Instead, he kept his voice measured. You should have kept that opinion to yourself, especially at the grave of the man you're talking about. Beckett's jaw shifted slightly, and for a moment, the edge of something mean flickered behind his eyes. You think people don't know what he was up to, he said, asking questions, stirring up audits, dragging old cases out of file drawers like they still matter. They do matter, Noah said, each syllable landing like a quiet drum beat. To the people still suffering. To the families that never saw justice. Beckett scoffed, stepped back half a foot, then gave that half-shrug men give when they want to dismiss something without admitting they're bothered. You're gonna find out same as he did, this town doesn't like being told what's broken. The words hung there for a long moment, and in that space, Noah felt something inside him. Click, not a decision, not yet, but a shift in direction, like a river beginning to change its course. He watched Beckett walk back toward his truck, the man's steps just a little too forced, now his posture too stiff for someone who believed he had nothing to lose. There was fear there, buried deep but real. And that told Noah more than any threat could. When he got into the car beside Miriam, she didn't ask what was said. She just looked at him the way you look at someone who's standing at the edge of something, about to choose whether to step forward or turn around. You're thinking about staying, aren't you? She asked, voice low. Noah nodded, not because he had made a plan, but because the alternative, leaving things as they were, felt like betrayal. There's something here I need to finish, he said. Something Julian started. Outside the window, Beckett's taillights disappeared into the distance, but the echo of his words still lingered like smoke from a fire that hadn't gone out. Noah leaned back in the seat, eyes closed for just a second, letting the weight of it settle. This wasn't just a funeral anymore, it was a warning, and he'd heard it loud and clear. The diner hadn't changed much in 20 years, same cracked leather booths, same flickering open sign in the window, and the same faint smell of old grease and burnt coffee clinging to every surface like memory. Noah sat in the corner booth facing the door, just like his father used to, one hand wrapped around a lukewarm mug while his eyes followed the tiny drops of rain tracing slow patterns down the glass. Outside Main Street was quiet but not empty, the kind of quiet that holds its breath like the whole town was waiting for something it didn't know how to prepare for. He could feel it in the way folks looked at him, the second glances, the half-nods, the polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. They knew who he was, and more importantly, they remembered who his brother had been. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a name tag that read Denise, refilled his coffee without asking, her movements practiced and gentle. He used to sit right here, she said softly, nodding toward the empty space across from him. Noah managed a quiet smile. I know. He told me you never let him pay on Sundays. Denise chuckled, then looked down, her voice dipping into something sadder. I wish more people around here had listened to him sooner. Might have made a difference. Noah didn't answer. He wasn't sure what would have made a difference anymore. As she walked away, he pulled a manila folder from his coat pocket and laid it on the table, flipping it open to reveal a set of photographs, old police reports, and a few handwritten notes in Julian's unmistakable script. His brother had been digging deep records of misconduct reports that never led to discipline complaints that vanished without trace. Even a list of names tied to settlements the department had quietly paid out under sealed agreements. At the top of the list, Sheriff Roy Beckett. Noah studied the pages like they might suddenly breathe, might explain the silence that had hung over this town for so long like fog no one questioned. He didn't see the door open, but he felt the shift in the room like the barometric pressure had dropped a few degrees, and looked up to see Beckett standing just inside, hat in one hand, rein still clinging to the shoulders of his jacket. Their eyes met, and for a second the world went still. Then the sheriff moved toward him with the slow, deliberate gait of a man used to being the center of gravity. He slid into the seat across from Noah without waiting for an invitation, eyes scanning the folder on the table before settling back on Noah's face. You really came back to poke this hornet's nest? Beckett asked, his voice low, casual, almost bored. You always were the more dramatic brother. Noah closed the folder without breaking eye contact. Julian wasn't dramatic. He was careful. That's what made him dangerous to you. Beckett leaned back, smiling like someone playing a hand of poker with cards marked only he could see. Careful, don't matter when people stop listening, he said. And around here they stopped listening to your brother a long time ago. That's the thing about truth, Noah replied, tone flat but unwavering. It doesn't stop being true just because folks get tired of hearing it. Beckett didn't blink, but something in his jaw tightened and he reached out slowly, turning the mug in front of him like he had every right to sit there to talk like equals. You don't know this place anymore, Noah. You left. You made your name somewhere else. Folks here, they need quiet more than they need justice. Is that what you call it now? Noah asked, his voice dipping just slightly. Quiet Beckett's smile vanished, then replaced by a hard stare. I call it keeping things from falling apart. You think digging through old files and whispering conspiracy theories is gonna bring peace. Let me tell you something, counselor. Peace ain't always pretty. Sometimes it's about knowing when to look the other way. Noah let the words hang in the air, not because he agreed, but because he needed to feel the weight of them before he pushed back. Or maybe peace is about facing what's broken and fixing it, even if it means burning down what protected the wrong people for too long. Beckett leaned forward, voice dropping into a near whisper. You'd better watch yourself, Ellison. You don't have the shield you used to. And this town doesn't like outsiders stirring up ghosts. I'm not an outsider, Noah said, quiet but firm. And I didn't come to stir up ghosts. I came to bury one. The two men stared at each other, the silence between them thick as wet concrete. Somewhere behind the counter a clock ticked just loud enough to be heard, a second hand dragging itself forward with steady mechanical resolve. Beckett finally stood, adjusting his coat, his hand brushing the side of his hip, just briefly, just enough for Noah to notice. A signal, a warning, maybe even a threat. Be careful what you think you're ready for, Beckett said as he turned to leave. Some truths don't fit in courtrooms. Noah didn't respond, not out loud. He just watched the door swing shut behind Beckett, watched the sheriff disappear into the gray blur of afternoon rain, and let his heart slow back to something steady. He reached for the folder again, fingers brushing the edge of one of Julian's notes, and reread the line his brother had underlined in red. The problem isn't what we don't know, it's what we've chosen to ignore. And in that moment, Noah understood something he hadn't been ready to admit until now. This wasn't about reopening old wounds. This was about refusing to let them heal wrong. The memorial was scheduled for early evening, just as the sun began slipping behind the hills, casting long shadows across the rows of gravestones, like fingers reaching backward in time. It wasn't an official event. There were no podiums, no speeches, no press releases, but word had spread quietly through the community enough that by 6 o'clock a small crowd had gathered near Julian Ellison's grave. Most came with candles or flowers, some with folded letters, and a few with only silence and heavy hearts. Noah stood among them, the collar of his coat turned up against the wind, his hands tucked into his pockets, watching as the faces came into focus. One by one, teachers, veterans, parents, former clients of Julian's people, whose lives he'd touched, not with grand gestures, but with steady, tireless work. The air was cold but calm, the sky a darkening blue, and every now and then someone would step forward and kneel by the stone, whisper something private, then rise again and drift to the edge of the gathering. No one spoke loudly, but the presence of so many people united by grief and quiet defiance hummed like a current under the surface. Noah could feel it in his chest, not adrenaline but something deeper, a kind of resolve waking up from a long sleep. He wasn't alone here. Julian hadn't been alone either. They had just been outnumbered by silence. He moved slowly to the head of the crowd, stopping a few feet from the grave, letting the rhythm of breath and stillness settle around him before speaking. My brother, he said, voice steady but low, spent most of his life being told that what he was doing didn't matter, that the system couldn't change, that the people he defended didn't count enough to be fought for. But he kept going anyway. Not because he thought he would win, but because he believed that losing quietly was worse. A few nods, a few murmurs of agreement, and the sound of someone sniffling quietly in the back. Noah paused, letting the weight of his words land, then added, "He told me once that justice wasn't about punishment, it was about accountability, about reminding the powerful they answer to someone too." A flicker of movement caught his eye then. Off to the side, just beyond the edge of the crowd, a dark SUV pulled into the cemetery lot and stopped with its headlights off. The door opened, and even before Noah could make out the figure he knew, Sheriff Roy Beckett stepped out slowly, one hand on the door, the other resting at his side, and stood watching from a distance. He wasn't in uniform this time, just a dark jacket and jeans, but his stance hadn't changed. Still squared, still heavy, still trying to carry a message without speaking. The crowd shifted slightly, a ripple of tension passing through it like a cold breeze. Noah held up a hand, calm but firm, and turned toward Beckett. Their eyes locked across the quiet field. Noah took a breath deep and measured, then walked toward him, boots crunching the loose gravel in the path. He could feel every eye behind him, but his focus was narrowed to the few feet between them. Each step a quiet dare, each breath a silent decision. When he stopped just a few yards from Beckett, neither man spoke for a long moment. The sun had dropped lower now, casting both their faces in half-shadow, and for a beat it felt like time had paused again. "You just couldn't stay away, could you?" Noah said, not as a question, but a recognition. Beckett shrugged one shoulder. "Just paying my respects," he replied, though the tone beneath it told a different story. "Funny," Noah said, "you had your chance at the funeral. That wasn't respect?" Beckett smiled tight, humorless. "Respect doesn't mean pretending someone was a saint. And disrespect doesn't mean you're protected," Noah said, his voice gaining edge. "Not anymore." There was a stillness between them, the kind that doesn't last because it isn't meant to. Beckett's hand drifted slightly closer to his waistband, a subtle shift Noah caught instantly. His body tensed, but he didn't move, didn't blink, just watched the slow calculation taking place behind Beckett's eyes. "You think you scare me?" the sheriff muttered low enough that only Noah could hear. "You and your files and your speeches." Noah stepped forward, voice soft but clear. "You're not scared of me," he said. "You're scared of what happens when the silence breaks." That's when Beckett's hand twitched just enough to brush the edge of the holster beneath his jacket, just enough to send a charge through the air like the flick of a match near dry kindling. And in that exact instant, three things happened. A sharp command rang out from the edge of the gathering. "Hands where I can see them," dozens of heads turned, and every off-duty officer present, some in civilian clothes, some still wearing badges, reached for weapons and closed the circle. Beckett froze, not because he wanted to, but because every muscle in his body had gone rigid with recognition. Noah didn't move. He didn't have to. He just looked Beckett in the eye, unblinking as the red dots from laser sights appeared faintly on the front of the sheriff's coat. For the first time, Beckett looked small, not physically but morally. His power, once absolute in this town, had cracked, and now he stood surrounded by men and women who had once called him sir, but now called him suspect. "You reached," said the officer closest to him, gun-drawn, stance locked. "Don't finish that motion." Beckett's jaw clenched, his breath shallow, his fingers twitching like they wanted to fight a battle he no longer had the numbers to win. "This is a setup," he growled through his teeth. "You think this is justice?" Noah stepped in just enough to let the next sentence land like a final verdict. "You made this happen the moment you brought your hate to a place meant for mourning." The wind picked up then, scattering leaves across the path, like nature itself was brushing the scene clean. And for a long moment no one said anything, because the truth had finally spoken louder than fear. Beckett's fingers hovered just a breath too long over the grip of his weapon, and in that sliver of time, the whole cemetery seemed to hold its breath, as if the trees, the air, and even the dead themselves knew a line was about to be crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The murmurs of the crowd fell to nothing, not because someone asked for silence, but because instinct took over, the kind passed down through generations who'd learned what danger feels like before it has a name. Noah didn't speak, didn't flinch, didn't so much as blink, though his heart had begun to drum a warning rhythm deep inside his chest. He had seen this exact moment play out too many times in courtrooms, in grainy video footage, in the quiet confessions of people who survived encounters they were never supposed to. But this wasn't a tape to be paused, and it wasn't someone else's story to narrate after the damage was done. This was now real, raw, unfolding with every second. Beckett refused to back down. And then, just as predicted, it happened. A second hand twitched. Not enough to draw, not enough to fire, but enough to confirm intent, and that was all it took. "Hands where I can see them," came the voice of Officer Kent, a younger deputy who had trained under Beckett, his voice sharp with adrenaline, but steady with authority. He stepped forward, sidearm already drawn, stance clean, and practiced eyes locked on the sheriff like he was a suspect, not a superior. Within moments, other officers joined in, not strangers, not outsiders, but his own colleagues, deputies who had once followed him without question, now forming a perimeter with weapons raised and eyes wide. The crowd had backed away instinctively, giving space not just to the unfolding scene but to the realization that something irreversible was happening. Beckett, once the immovable force in this town, now stood at the center of a circle. He couldn't control his authority unraveling in real time, like a thread pulled too fast. "You're making a mistake," Beckett muttered, his voice tight, like a man holding back the panic he didn't think he could still feel. "This is a damn mistake." But the words didn't carry the same weight they once did. No one flinched, no one stepped down. Officer Kent didn't even look at him. "Drop the act, Sheriff," he said calmly. "You're done." Noah watched it unfold with a strange stillness in his chest. Not satisfaction, not revenge, but something more grounded, more sorrowful. This was the end of a man who had hidden behind a badge for too long, who had used fear and familiarity to bend the rules until they only served him. And now, stripped of the illusion, Beckett looked almost human again, sweat on his forehead, lips pressed into a line, eyes darting not with control, but desperation. Then came the final click, the one that changed everything. Handcuffs. The sound of steel meeting, wrist clean and final, louder than a gunshot in the silence that followed. Officer Riley, another one of Beckett's former allies, was the one to make the arrest. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask permission, didn't wait for a higher-up to step in. "You're under arrest for attempted intimidation of a federal officer," he said firmly, voice low but broadcast clear enough for everyone to hear. Beckett's jaw clenched. He twisted slightly, but the weight of hands on his back, the tightening of the cuffs, grounded him in place. "You don't understand," he spat, breath short. "This isn't how this ends." Riley leaned closer, meeting his eyes without blinking. It just did. Noah stepped forward then, not as a prosecutor, not as a brother, but as a witness. He looked at Beckett, really looked, and said the words that had been waiting for years to be spoken. "You thought the badge would protect you from consequence, but it only ever protected you from time. And time just ran out." There was no cheering, no applause, no catharsis, just the hollow sound of Beckett being led away in cuffs, boots dragging slightly across the gravel, dignity crumbling with each step. Some officers turned away, unable to watch. Others stood frozen, caught between disbelief and relief. And a few, those who had once defended him behind closed doors, just stared at the ground, their silence louder than any protest. Behind them, the crowd began to slowly return to stillness, people murmuring softly, exchanging glances that spoke of long-buried truths, finally rising to the surface. Miriam stood off to the side, her arm around her son, eyes never leaving the path where Beckett disappeared behind a cruiser door. She didn't smile, but when she looked at Noah, there was something new in her expression, an acknowledgement, maybe even gratitude, not for revenge but for the fact that someone had finally stood up and refused to flinch. Noah walked back toward the headstone, stopping just short of the grave, the earth still fresh, the air around it somehow lighter than before. He took a deep breath, the kind you don't realize you've been holding for years. Then he crouched down slowly and whispered to the stone, "We're not done yet, Julian, but we're getting there." A gust of wind swept through the trees above, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves and the soft crackle of candles still burning. And for the first time since returning to this place, Noah felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of justice taking root. The courthouse records room smelled like dust, disuse, and something older, something that hadn't seen sunlight in decades but still clung to the walls like old secrets, refusing to be forgotten. Noah stood just inside the door, shoulders squared beneath the weight of a folder that had grown heavier by the hour, not from paper but from the history it carried. The woman behind the counter, Janice, a clerk who looked like she'd been there since the building's foundation was poured, glanced up from her screen with a tired kind of curiosity and said, "You're Ellison's brother, right?" Her voice wasn't suspicious, just cautious, like she wasn't sure if helping him meant opening something best left buried. Noah nodded once slowly. "I need access to archived personnel files, internal affairs, reports, disciplinary records, any civil complaints involving the sheriff's office in the last 15 years. She blinked, and for a second, something flickered across her face. Recognition maybe, or the first shadow of unease. But then she looked away and typed, without another word. The printer groaned awake behind her sputtering paper that would tell stories few were ever meant to read. While he waited, Noah glanced around the room. Old case files stacked in corners, filing cabinets with broken locks, folders marked with dates long enough ago to be forgotten. This was where truth went to disappear under layers of bureaucracy and deliberate neglect. Janice returned with a small stack of pages, her lips pressed in a thin line. "You didn't get this from me," she muttered, sliding the papers across the counter. Noah took them quietly, nodding once, then left without a word. Outside, the late afternoon sun was starting to sink behind the rooftops, casting long golden shadows across the sidewalk, but Noah barely noticed. His mind was already racing ahead, searching, scanning, connecting dots that had taken his brother years to uncover. He found a bench on the square, sat down and began reading. Each file opened another door, a deputy reassigned after a use of force complaint that vanished from public record. A local teenager hospitalized after a routine traffic stop, no charges filed, no video available. And always at the edge of every report, the same name, Sheriff Roy Beckett. Sometimes directly involved, sometimes merely mentioned, but always present like a watermark across every abuse that went unpunished. Julian had circled names, underlined patterns, even drawn arrows between unrelated cases that now seemed undeniably linked. Noah could almost hear his brother's voice in the margins, that same blend of frustration and determination he'd always had when the truth didn't come easily. "It's not about what they did," Julian had once said, "it's about what they were allowed to keep doing." And now, looking at the weight of these pages, Noah understood how close his brother had been to pulling the whole system into the light. He spent the next hour making calls, first to an old colleague in the DOJ, then to a former investigator who owed him a favor, then to a legal contact in the State Ethics Commission. Each conversation added another layer of urgency, another person willing to confirm what he now knew without question. Beckett had protected more than himself. He'd built a wall around the department, around the town, around the truth, and for years everyone had played along because it was easier than facing what lay beneath. That night, Noah sat alone in Julian's old office, the desk still piled with case notes and manila folders, the walls lined with books that smelled of sweat, coffee, and late nights spent fighting battles too big for one man. The chair still squeaked the same way. It always had. The clock still ticked in that stubborn off rhythm, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked like it had something urgent to say. Noah flipped through more files, tracing dates, matching names, and slowly, methodically, he began building a timeline. There was no single smoking gun, no confession, no secret recording, no hidden camera footage waiting to go viral. But there was something more dangerous, a pattern, a web. A years-long trail of buried accountability that pointed straight back to the man who now sat in a jail cell acting like it was all a misunderstanding. By midnight, Noah had compiled enough to draft a preliminary report, names, dates, internal memos, unredacted statements. He saved a copy to a secure drive, printed 3 others, and sealed them in envelopes with labels that read, "To be released in the event of my arrest or disappearance." He wasn't being dramatic, he was being thorough. The next morning he walked into the district attorney's office without an appointment, placed the envelope on the receptionist's desk, and said calmly, "This needs to be seen before the arraignment. It involves coordinated obstruction of justice, falsified reports, and suppression of evidence going back at least a decade." The receptionist blinked, hesitated, then took the envelope with both hands, her eyes scanning his face like she wasn't sure if she should be worried for him or for whoever he was about to expose. Later that afternoon, he received a call from the assistant DA, her voice clipped but professional. "I've reviewed the documents. Some of this goes beyond the local department. We're initiating a formal inquiry. You'll be contacted." Noah thanked her, then hung up and stared at the empty space in front of him, the weight of what he'd set in motion sinking in like cold water through fabric. It was out of his hands now, but not out of his reach. And as he stood on Julian's porch that evening, watching the horizon fade from orange to gray, he knew there was no turning back. The silence had been broken. The system had been forced to listen. And just as slow, reluctant, but real had begun to stir from its long sleep. The courthouse felt different that morning, not because anything had changed in the building itself, but because something in the air had shifted like the first deep breath after a storm that had threatened to swallow everything in its path. Noah stood just inside the main doors, adjusting his tie with slow, deliberate movements, the kind of rhythm a man builds when every step forward carries the weight of 1,000 backward stairs. The marble floor beneath him gleamed under the sterile overhead lights, and every footstep that echoed down the hallway seemed to announce more than presence. It announced accountability. People had gathered early. Reporters milled about near the steps, their cameras and notebooks, ready eyes sharp and hungry for moments that could turn into headlines. Uniformed officers whispered quietly near the benches, some glancing toward the defense table, with expressions that shifted between loyalty and shame. A few members of the public had shown up too, folks who'd heard what happened at the cemetery, who'd seen the footage that leaked just enough to catch fire across town. They weren't here for the spectacle. They were here to see if the system could actually follow through on the promise it so rarely kept. Noah took a seat in the third row behind the prosecution, placing his leather-bound folder on the bench beside him. He didn't plan to speak today, but he'd come prepared nonetheless, because you never know when the truth might need defending, even in a room where it's supposed to be safe. The judge hadn't entered yet, and the courtroom buzzed with the quiet hum of conversation movement and the rustling of paper that always precedes something that can't be undone. Then the door to the holding corridor opened with a heavy metallic click, and the room quieted, as Roy Beckett was led in hands-cuffed jaw, clenched eyes, scanning the room with the forced bravado of a man who still didn't understand how his power had been stripped away so cleanly. He wore an orange jumpsuit now, the fabric stiff and unflattering, a far cry from the crisp badge and tailored uniform he used to carry like armor. But it wasn't just the clothes that betrayed him, it was the way he walked, slower, smaller, like someone moving through a place that used to belong to them, but no longer recognized their presence. He caught sight of Noah, and paused, for the briefest moment, their eyes locking across the room. There was no fury in Beckett's face now, no threat laced behind his stare, only confusion and something else that looked too much like disbelief. Noah held the gaze steady and unmoved, until Beckett was forced to keep walking the guards, leading him to the defense table without a word. His attorney, a stiff, overly polite man from out of town, whispered something in his ear, but Beckett didn't respond. His mind was elsewhere, still spinning in the place where men like him never expected to be seen for what they really were. The judge entered promptly at 9, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a low bun and a reputation for fairness that had earned her quiet respect across party lines. She wasted no time. "We are here today for arraignment and preliminary hearing on the matter of Roy Beckett, charged with multiple counts, including obstruction of justice, intimidation of a federal officer, and unlawful use of a firearm." She began, her voice calm, but laced with gravity. "This court will hear evidence submitted in support of the charges and determine whether the case proceeds to trial." As the prosecutor stood, Noah recognized her, a former colleague from his days in federal service. She was sharp, methodical, and utterly uninterested in theatrics. "Your Honor," she began, "what we present today is not conjecture. It is documented, witnessed, and supported by years of buried complaints and fresh violations." Mr. Beckett was not acting out of fear. He was acting out of long-held entitlement. What happened at the cemetery was not the beginning, it was the culmination. She motioned to the screen as video footage from the cemetery flickered to life. The courtroom dimmed slightly, the images sharp, the sound clear enough to bring back the weight of the moment. Noah watched himself on screen, still calm, unwavering, while Beckett's body language shifted with each frame, from confident to confrontational, from smug to startled, and finally to cornered. The moment his hand brushed the weapon's grip, the room tensed in real time, even now. You could hear the voices shouting the commands to freeze, the response of trained officers moving in. It wasn't just incriminating, it was undeniable. The prosecutor let the silence speak for itself when the video ended. She didn't grandstand. She simply turned back to the judge and said, "We respectfully submit this as clear evidence of intent and imminent threat, and we request the court move this case forward without delay." Beckett's lawyer stood slowly, his voice composed but lacking conviction. He argued fear, claimed provocation, painted a picture of a man overwhelmed by grief and confusion, but the judge wasn't moved. She reviewed the evidence, asked only a few precise questions, and then leaned back in her chair with a look that said she'd seen this play before and she remembered how it ended. "This court finds sufficient cause to proceed to trial," she said firmly. "Mr. Beckett will remain in custody until that time." Noah didn't celebrate. He didn't smile or speak or even nod. He just sat there, hands folded, letting the truth of the moment wash over him like cold water against tired skin. Beckett didn't look back as he was led from the room, but if he had, he would have seen something simple and powerful in Noah's stillness. Not triumph, but closure beginning to form. Not the end, but the middle finally turning. And for the first time in years, it felt like justice might be more than a word people whispered when they were tired of being polite. It might actually be real. The days that followed moved slowly, like time itself was trying to decide whether it wanted to keep moving forward or turn back. The town was quieter than usual, but not in the peaceful way it used to be. This was the kind of quiet that lingered after something loud, something public, something no one could unsee or unhear. People avoided eye contact in the grocery store aisles. Conversations dropped when certain names came up, and even the local radio station, usually full of cheerful banter and country ballads, had turned its tone cautious, measured, almost somber. Noah could feel it pressing in from all sides, the weight of silence, not born from ignorance, but from people finally realizing they had known too much for too long and said nothing. He walked to the courthouse most mornings now, not because he had a role to play in the proceedings yet, but because presence mattered. People needed to see him walking those steps, holding his head up, acting like truth still had a place to stand. And if he was being honest, he needed it too. It was easier to stay steady when his shoes were hitting pavement, when his shoulders remembered how it felt to carry responsibility without fear. Inside, the staff had started treating him differently, not with deference but with a quiet respect, like they finally saw in him what Julian had always carried alone. One morning as he passed through security, the bailiff stopped him gently, his hand resting near his belt in habit not threat. "Ellison," he said, "you gonna testify if this thing goes to full trial?" Noah looked at the man, saw the sincerity behind the question, and answered just as plainly, "If they need me to, I will." The bailiff nodded once slowly, then stepped aside. "Good," he said. "Some of us, we need to hear it from someone who never looked away." The pressure hadn't gone away, though. If anything, it had grown tighter, more focused. The sheriff's arrest had shattered the illusion, but illusions don't disappear without a fight. They regroup, they whisper, they try to rebuild. Rumors began swirling in hushed tones that Beckett was being framed, that Julian's death wasn't as clean as the reports claimed, that Noah had returned to settle a personal vendetta, not to seek justice. And Noah knew those narratives weren't accidental. They were being planted, nurtured by the same few who had everything to lose if the truth spread too wide. He met with the assistant DA that afternoon in a conference room lined with manila folders, dry erase boards, and the kind of government coffee that always tasted like burnt compromise. She was sharp-eyed and methodical, flipping through documents, like each one was a step on a path she already knew by heart. "We have enough to move forward," she said without looking up. "But we're going to get pushback, public, political, maybe even from inside." Noah nodded. "You expecting threats?" She looked at him then, her mouth a hard line. "I'm expecting pressure. That's worse. Threats you can trace. Pressure comes wearing suits and smiles." That night, Noah found himself back in Julian's office, the place lit only by a single desk lamp and the soft creak of the floorboards beneath his pacing steps. The files were still spread out, some of them old and brittle, some fresh from printers that still smelled like heat and toner. He ran his fingers along the edge of one photo, a grainy image of a young man with a swollen eye and a badge number barely visible in the background. Julian had written a note on the back in black ink. "One story doesn't change a system. 100 stories start a movement." Noah read the words aloud, almost without meaning to, and they echoed in the room like prayer. He sat down slowly, his hands folding in front of him, and let his mind trace the steps ahead. The trial would be hard not because the facts weren't clear, but because clarity often gets drowned out by noise when power is threatened. He knew Beckett's defense team would twist every angle, poke holes in motive, paint Julian as reckless and himself as manipulative. They'd lean on the fact that the video didn't show a weapon drawn, only a hand moving. They'd say fear justified the gesture, that grief explained the words, that politics motivated the arrest. And that's what haunted Noah most. Not that lies would be told, but that people might believe them if truth wasn't louder. The next morning, he met with a handful of community leaders at the town library, retired teachers, clergy, a local business owner or two. They sat in a circle of folding chairs, a pot of coffee in the center, and the room smelled of old books and cautious hope. "We're not here to pick sides," the pastor said, his voice steady but tired. "We're here to understand what comes next." Noah took a breath, then spoke the only way he knew how, plainly and from the heart. "Julian didn't die because of one man's mistake," he said. "He died in the shadow of a system that let too many wrong things slide. Beckett was just the loudest face of it. But what we choose to do now, how we hold people accountable, how we support the ones still speaking up, that's what's going to define this town." They didn't argue, they didn't cheer, but they listened. And when the meeting ended, each person shook his hand a little longer than usual, like they knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but were at least willing to walk beside him. And for Noah, that mattered more than any verdict, because truth without community was just noise. But truth spoken together, that had the power to outlast even the deepest silence. The courtroom was full before the clock struck 10, the kind of full that hums with quiet tension and restrained breath, where every cough feels intrusive and every creak of a chair draws eyes. There was no jury today, just sentencing, but still the pew-like benches were packed with faces from every corner of the town, some familiar to Noah, others blurred by time and distance, yet all drawn here by the same unspoken pull. A final chapter was being written, and even those who had avoided the headlines or mumbled support in private had shown up to see how it would end. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting sharp geometric shapes across the polished wood floor, and the air carried the faint scent of old paper coffee, and something like sweat, though no one moved enough to earn it. Noah sat in the second row, hands folded loosely in his lap, his back straight, eyes steady. He hadn't intended to speak, hadn't prepared remarks, but the assistant DA had asked if he'd be willing to make a statement, and somehow he knew he couldn't stay silent. Not now, not when the system was finally preparing to speak in return. Beckett entered from the holding corridor, shackled at the wrists and ankles, wearing the same blank expression he'd worn through most of the trial, though now the mask had started to slip. He looked smaller than before, not physically, but in the way power recedes, when it no longer has an audience willing to clap. He didn't glance at the gallery, didn't scan the room for allies, and when his attorney whispered something to him, he didn't respond. There was nothing left to spin, no defense to perform, just the judge's voice and the weight of decisions about to land. The judge, firm and composed, addressed the courtroom without drama. "This court finds Roy Beckett guilty on all counts brought before it: obstruction of justice, intimidation of a federal officer, abuse of power under color of law, and repeated violations of public trust." Her words were measured but not cold. She looked up, meeting Beckett's gaze directly, her eyes as unflinching as stone. "You used your badge not to protect but to dominate, not to serve but to silence. And in doing so, you violated not just the law, but the very soul of this community." Beckett's face tightened, but he said nothing. The judge continued, "You've shown no remorse. And while this court does not sentence from emotion, it cannot ignore the impact of your actions on those you were sworn to protect." Then she nodded once toward the prosecution's table. "Mr. Ellison, I understand you've requested to speak." Noah rose slowly, feeling the weight of eyes settle over him like a coat he'd worn before. He walked to the lectern, resting his fingertips lightly on its edge, his voice low but steady as he began. "Your Honor, I don't come here asking for vengeance. I'm not here to celebrate another man's punishment. What I want, what my brother died fighting for, is recognition. Recognition that the law is not a weapon to be wielded at the whim of the powerful, but a covenant between people and their government." He paused, letting the words breathe before continuing. Julian believed in that covenant even when it didn't believe in him. He spoke for the voiceless, fought for those ignored, and he paid a price for that courage. But what happened at his funeral, what happened after, proved something even more important. that silence does not have to be the last word. Behind him, he heard the faint sound of a throat clearing, someone shifting in their seat, but he kept going. Beckett thought his years in power meant no one would challenge him. But the truth is, power means nothing without accountability. And today, accountability finally has a face. He stepped back, not looking at Beckett, not needing to. He returned to his seat, heart pounding but expression calm, knowing he had spoken not just for himself, but for every name in those files, every story buried under bureaucracy, every cry for help that had once gone ignored. The judge nodded again. "Thank you, Mr. Ellison." She turned back to Beckett. "This court sentences you to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole." There was no gasp, no applause. Just a thick collective exhale as the gavel struck once clean, final, irreversible. Beckett flinched at the sound, and for the first time he looked back toward the gallery, his eyes searching for something, recognition, sympathy, perhaps even defiance. But there was none to be found. His legacy had been rewritten in real time, and there were no more believers left in the pew. As officers stepped forward to escort him out, the room remained still. A few heads turned, a few glances exchanged, but most people simply watched, letting the weight of the moment land where it should. When Beckett passed by Noah, he paused just half a second, but enough for their eyes to meet. "You did this," he muttered, his voice flat, almost dull. Noah didn't blink. "No," he said evenly. "You did this to yourself." And with that, the former sheriff was led away, shackles clinking softly against the tile, his last step into the public eye, now sealed not with honor but consequence. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon had brightened. The clouds that had loomed all morning had broken apart, and the light that spilled over the square felt clearer, somehow sharper, as if the town itself had been holding its breath. Noah stood for a moment on the steps, letting the sun warm his face, letting the silence settle in, not the silence of fear, but of something finally at rest. He didn't feel victorious. He felt honest, and that at last was enough. The courthouse doors had barely closed behind Roy Beckett before the town began to shift in ways so quiet most folks didn't notice, at least not at first. It didn't happen with sirens or press releases or crowds gathered in the streets. It happened in the corners of coffee shops, in the pauses between greetings at the grocery store, in the way people spoke each other's names with a little more care, a little less fear. There was no overnight transformation, no miracle moment where justice bloomed across every block, but there was a current moving underneath the surface, slow and steady like a tide changing direction. Noah noticed it first in the smallest details, the clerk at the records office no longer avoiding his eye when she handed him a file, the local mechanic calling him sir without the usual edge of suspicion, the deputy who used to cross the street when he saw Julian walking now offering a nod when their paths met. The shift wasn't about guilt or redemption, it was about recognition, about people finally realizing that silence hadn't protected them, it had only protected the ones who did harm. That recognition stretched beyond Noah, beyond the courthouse. At the elementary school, Julian's name was added to a scholarship fund, one started by a teacher who used to argue with him at school board meetings, but had since admitted quietly, and without ceremony, that he'd been right more than wrong. At the church, the pastor mentioned the trial in his sermon, not as gossip, but as a reminder that standing for something costs and that silence, too, comes with a price. Sometimes justice takes its time, he said, but when it arrives it leaves no doubt. Noah sat in the back pew that morning, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the wooden cross above the pulpit, not because he needed saving, but because he needed space to breathe, to understand what came next. After the service, people approached him not to thank or congratulate, but to talk, really talk in ways they hadn't before. They asked about Julian, what he was like when the cameras weren't on, when the courthouse wasn't packed. Noah told them stories, funny ones, hard ones, ordinary ones that made his brother real again, not just a symbol wrapped in tragedy. Later that week, the mayor invited Noah to a community forum, something he hadn't done in years. It wasn't a stunt. There were no cameras, no reporters. Just 30 or so residents gathered in the old library hall, folding chairs, arranged in a circle, a pot of coffee growing cold at the center of it all. Noah didn't come with notes. He just listened. A young mother spoke first, saying she no longer knew what to tell her kids when they asked about the badge. An older man followed voice, trembling slightly, confessing that he'd worked under Beckett for 12 years and had stayed quiet too long. "I thought keeping my head down was doing my job," he said. "Turns out I was just helping him keep his up." When Noah did speak, he didn't preach. He didn't scold. He reminded them that reckoning wasn't the end, it was the start of responsibility. That moving forward didn't mean forgetting it, meant refusing to repeat. This town, he said, gently gets to decide what kind of story it tells from here on out. But stories need truth to survive. They need courage to breathe. The days blurred after that, meetings, conversations, quiet moments on Julian's porch where Noah sat with a notebook in his lap and the ghost of his brother's voice echoing in his memory like a song without an end. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Miriam came by with her son. The boy held a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked by the creek and asked if he could leave them by Julian's grave. Noah smiled, his voice caught halfway between pride and ache. "Of course you can," he said, kneeling beside him as they placed the stems gently at the base of the stone. As they stood there in silence, Miriam glanced over, her voice quiet. "Do you think he'd be proud?" Noah didn't answer right away. He watched the wind stir. The grass listened to the distant hum of a lawnmower 3 houses down, then looked at her and said, "I think he'd be tired. But yeah, I think he'd be proud." She nodded, her eyes glossy but steady. "We're still here," she whispered. "We're still trying." And that in the end was the thing that mattered most. Not the verdict, not the headlines, not even the sentence. What mattered was that people had begun trying again, trying to speak up, trying to listen, trying to remember that justice is not a destination but a practice, something you carry into every choice, every policy, every act of decency. Noah knew the work wasn't done. He knew there were still files to be opened, still names that needed saying, still systems that didn't just bend but broke. But in that quiet, ordinary evening, standing at the grave of a man who never stopped pushing, Noah felt something loosen inside his chest. Not relief, not release, just a breath. A single full breath that came without the usual weight of having to prove who he was or why he had returned. It was the breath of someone who knew the fight wasn't over but no longer felt like he was fighting it alone. And for the first time, since stepping back into that town, Noah Ellison allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, justice could grow roots. The morning sky was soft with haze, the kind that rolls in without sound and seems to make everything feel slower, more deliberate, like the world itself had paused just long enough to take a breath. Noah stood at the edge of the cemetery path, one hand resting lightly on the cool metal of the gate, the other holding a small bundle of white lilies wrapped in brown paper. The ground beneath his feet was still damp from the early dew, and the air carried the scent of turned soil, sun-warmed grass, and something faintly floral that might have been wild jasmine. He let his eyes trace the familiar row of stones, the carved names and dates telling stories that only a few still remembered in full. As he made his way toward Julian's grave, he noticed how the wind moved gently through the trees, their leaves whispering against one another like voices too soft to interrupt the stillness. The grave was clean. Someone had come before him, maybe Miriam, maybe a stranger, paying quiet respect. But Noah still knelt beside it and cleared a stray leaf from the edge of the stone. He placed the flowers down without ceremony, adjusting them so they wouldn't fall when the breeze picked up. Then he sat back on his heels and simply stayed there for a while, not speaking, not thinking too hard, just letting the silence settle in like an old friend who didn't need explanation. "You'd laugh at all this," he said, eventually, his voice low and even, "at how quiet things have gotten after all that noise." He glanced toward the distant hills, eyes narrowing just slightly against the light. "They're trying, though. I can see it. I can feel it. It's not much, but it's real." He paused, exhaled slowly through his nose, and brushed his fingertips across the name etched in stone. "It shouldn't have taken your funeral to wake them up, but at least now they're awake." Noah stood slowly, knees stiff from the cold ground, and turned back toward the main path, not because he was in a rush to leave, but because there was nothing left unsaid. The rest would live in how he walked in, how he carried his brother's name, not like a banner but like a foundation. He passed the stone bench where Julian used to sit and scribble notes during long Sunday walks, and paused there a moment, one hand brushing across the back of the worn concrete. "They're naming the Civic Center after you," he murmured. that'd make you roll your eyes. But it's something. It means something. Back in town, the streets had begun to stir with late-morning movement kids on bikes, a man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the bakery, a few cars rolling slowly through the intersection near the courthouse. It was the kind of quiet, familiar rhythm Noah remembered from long before things had fallen apart, before truth had to shout, just to be heard over habit. He walked the length of Main Street without hurry, stopping once to greet a woman sitting outside the hardware store who gave him a smile that felt real, not polite, not forced, just simple and honest. "You staying long?" she asked, her voice, raspy with age but kind. Noah hesitated, then shrugged. Long enough to finish what Julian started. She nodded, as if that was the best answer he could have given. Later that afternoon, Noah returned to his brother's office, now technically his own, though he hadn't made any changes. The walls still held, Julian's old legal diplomas still wore the framed photos of community meetings, still smelled faintly of old books and something warm like cedar. He sat at the desk and opened the drawer that used to stick at the corner, pulling out a small notebook Julian had kept tucked under a stack of case files. Inside were scribbled notes in that familiar quick script, questions, reminders, names, and at the top of one page, underlined twice in red, "Truth needs witnesses, not just believers." Noah stared at those words for a long time, running his thumb along the edge of the paper. He understood now more than ever what his brother meant, not that truth couldn't exist alone, but that it could never grow without people willing to speak it out loud, to carry it into rooms where it had been denied, into systems that had pretended not to see. He closed the notebook gently, as if it might bruise, and tucked it into his coat pocket. As the sun dipped toward the trees once again, he stood at the office window and looked out across the square. A group of teenagers walked by, laughing, backpacks slung low, the kind of careless joy he hadn't seen much around here lately. One of them paused and pointed toward the mural that had recently gone up on the side of the library, a tribute to community leaders' faces painted in soft color, and there among them, Julian's smile captured mid-thought, like he was still waiting to say something else. Noah watched them for a moment, then turned back to the desk, reaching for the small stack of letters he'd promised to finish writing. Not legal briefs, not statements, just letters to families, to clients, to names buried in the paperwork that Julian had never had time to properly answer. Because even if the case was closed, the stories weren't, and he owed them more than a verdict. He picked up a pen, wrote the first name at the top of a page, and began with 7 quiet words, "I'm writing to tell you the truth." Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a slow breath, and somewhere beyond the courthouse, a bell rang, once long and low, as if marking not an ending but a beginning that had taken far too long to arrive. And Noah, for the first time since he returned, felt something close to peace, not because the fight was finished, but because he finally knew how to keep it going. What this story reminds us, especially those of us who've lived long enough to see the world change and circle back again, is that justice doesn't come quickly, and it never comes easily. It takes persistence, truth-telling, and the courage to stand up even when the system pushes back. Noah didn't fight for revenge. He fought to honor his brother's voice, and to remind a town, and maybe all of us, that silence protects no one, and accountability begins with ordinary people refusing to look away. For those who've experienced injustice or who've carried the weight of being unheard, this is a call to remember you are not alone, and it is never too late to speak out. Whether it's standing up in a courtroom or simply telling your story to someone who needs to hear it, your voice matters more than you know. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you of the importance of truth, dignity, and standing tall even when it's uncomfortable, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart. Because we believe in the power of storytelling, not just to entertain, but to heal, to teach, and to inspire. And sometimes just hearing a story like this is enough to help someone take that first step toward justice. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being part of something that matters.